Hello, so this is 4 random books, and the 4 random books we have today are about the non-sexy part of history. They are Warship Builder, at some point it's going to turn out quite well. I'll see the focus point is now somewhere around about my head. Technology and Naval Combat in the 20th Century and Beyond, which has a very nice section entitled Technology, Shipbuilding and Future Combat in Germany by Michael Elsatz, and British Naval Procurement and Technological Change by John T. Samedi, Italian Warship Construction and Maritime Strategy by Brian P. Sutherland, Japanese Naval Construction by David C. Evans. There's even a section on the French Navy, but we can ignore that if you really wish. And all sorts of things. It's worthwhile thinking about. Liberty Factory! Woohoo! The untold story of Henry Kaiser's Oregon shipyards. And Liberty's War. Yeah, at some point this will get into focus. By Herman E. Melton. Yes, I know, I need an autofocusing camera, but this is a manual focus one. It worked well when I was in my room. Now, why am I not rushing? Because normally these are 15 minutes and I'm normally jumping straight in. Well, I'm sort of explaining some of the things going forward. Because at some point I am possibly going to repeat books. In fact, quite likely, because honestly I haven't kept a list of them. I should have done, but I didn't. But simply put, that's not really the structure 4 random books depends on. 4 random books is me finding a book, in this case, this one, and going, ooh, I like the look of that book today. What am I going to do? What would be the other 3 books which would go with it? And what story, what history would they tell? The minute I picked up this one, I thought, hang on. There is a sexy word on this, liberty. If you notice, when you want to sell a history book, Churchill, Hitler, liberty, these are phrases you might well see depending on the topic. It's quite common. I know I mean quite a lot, but it's hard to get around this without upsetting people, publishers and book writers. There is nothing wrong. In fact, it's very sensible as a marketing aim to use the sexy words in your title. Churchill, Hitler's weird sex life. That's, I think, a whole documentary coming on some channel at some point. And yeah, that'll get a lot of people watching it. Although, honestly, wanting to know about Hitler bumping uglies is frankly beyond me. But leaving that to one side, that is a lot of history. You got this one. Warship builders. Oh yeah, we're talking about the warships. Liberty Factory. Yeah, we're building the Liberty ships. This is the, I suppose, in quotes, academic. Technology and naval combat in the 20th century and beyond. The thing is, all these books are useful. This one, its catchy title, belies a huge amount of content which should be read by academics, because honestly, most of my colleagues, when I start talking about infrastructure, construction, and the mercantile marine, look at me. Now, yes, I have to admit the naval ones tend to be better than the military ones. I love you all equally, but if your obsession is land armies, you tend to, at the moment you get into the minutiae of naval combat, I do see the eyes glaze over. You're all wonderful historians. It's just not your area. There's no problem with that. Trust me. if you started talking to me about the minutiae of platoon combat in, I don't know, platoon combat and administration in the Napoleonic Wars, I would probably sit in there going, I find this interesting. But the next time someone told me about it, I'd be going, oh, not this again. Because it's interesting, but it's not something I really am passionate about. I know, I'm a historian, so I'm supposed to love all history, but honestly, secretly, I don't. I love the cataphracts in Rome Total War. I have done no research on them, because for me they are just cool cavalry. Well, when I say I did no research, I only bought a couple of books about them and I only looked at them. So that's basically no research for me, okay? And honestly, Rome Total War, they are very cool cavalry, but that doesn't leave all of them in it. But we'll leave that to one side. So, the whole point is, there is a lot more going on than necessary the title tells you, and necessary the front cover. So my advice with books is never, ever judge them by the cover. Never judge them by the title. Although you can predict sales quite well by those two things. What you need to judge them by, if you're really, really smart, and you've only got a few seconds because you're reading in a bookstore, and they don't like you reading the whole book, is not the last chapter. They know it's up there. Go to the second to last chapter, a random page in it, and start reading. See how the content is. If it's good, if it's well written at this point, if it's erudite, and if it's got some referencing, if it's got some facts in which you honestly don't know, if it's well laid out with lovely pictures, and I mean, this is well laid out with lovely pictures, then the odds are it's a good book. And it's going to have something worthwhile knowing. And this one, the second to last chapter, is The Transformation of the US Navy by Norman Friedman. I don't even need to tell you that is a good chapter. In this one, the second last chapter, is called Witness to Annihilation. And it's a good chapter. Let's leave it at that. Last one. Second last chapter. We can build anything. Wartime Navy Yards. Or alternatively, if you decide the conclusion is the last chapter, the government pays for everything in there. Private builders and contractor-operated yards. Wow. Under wartime conditions, government money, taxpayers' money, was used to pay for everything in private factories. Oh, that is what total war mobilization really means. The pooling of everything. The government checkbook pays for it all. Because that is what a total war is. Second to last but a chapter. Anyway, let's start off with the book which started this entire discussion off. And I am actually going to go to that second last chapter. From the refugees from the Sahagran, restoring the Augustus Thomas to service was taking more time than expected. The ship was anchored in San Pedro Bay, where underwater welding on our hull was going slowly. Nothing else could be done to the engine room until the hull was sealed and all the water pumped out. We had boarded the ship on the 7th of December, and when the holiday season arrived, we still had no electrical power on board. The US Army furnished us a complete Christmas dinner of turkey, dressing, gravy, Brussels sprouts, cranberry sauce, and mince pie. But it was the bleakest Yule I have ever experienced. By this time, the shortage of liquor in the war zone had shut down the heavy drinking bouts of the repair crew. Some foul-tasting medical alcohol was acquired from the shore by the captain, but even the hardcore drinkers had to dilute it heavily with grapefruit juice to get it down. This Kickapoo Joy Juice, named after the Hillbillies cocktail in Little Am cartoons, prompted a party outside my stateroom on Christmas Eve. The festivities soon descended into a mournful affair. I longed to sing the traditional carols with others, but no one showed any interest. With my flashlight, I retreated to the bow of the darkened vessel, where I sat and recited what I remembered of the second chapter of the Gospel of St. Luke. The Bible I had dutifully packed for the voyage, like all my belongings from Sahagun, was at the bottom of the sea. Singing aloud to myself those carols I knew by heart, I thought of my wife and my family back home, and cursed myself for turning down a chance to be shipped home in time for Christmas. Resumed our work on Thomas on the day after Christmas. Without electricity, we had no ship's radio, and so were unaware of the recent landings on the Philippine island of Mindoro, to our northwest. General MacArthur had ordered the invasion so that the airstrips could be built on the island, much closer to his prime objective, Luzon, and its principal city of Manila. The Mindoro operation led to some of the most deadly attacks faced by the merchant marine in the Pacific theatre of war. We were soon to get an unpleasant personal introduction to casualties of the invasion. On the day after New Year's in 1945, I was awakened before dawn by the sound of a ship tying up alongside the Thomas. Sighting up in my bunk and peering out the porthole, I saw a spotlight from a live vessel in control of a derricked Liberty ship that had been horribly mangled and burned. Soon the wreck's a stench overwhelmed the air of the Thomas. Dressing quickly, I went on deck with a flashlight in hand, where I could see more details of the carnage. But the unbearable smell forced me to retreat forward, where I could hear men talking. Bob Stone, the recently promoted first mate, was assisting the tie-up with the help of two Filipinos who were working with us on the Thomas. Bob told me the Liberty ship had been the victim of a kamikaze attack during the invasion of Mindoro, a place unknown to either of us. The Navy vessel towing the derelict had been ordered to tie it up to our ship. I was outraged and wondered if I was to be stuck forever in the war zone repairing Liberty ships blasted by kamikaze pilots. The arrival of the SS William Sharon sparked both curiosity and confusion for all our hands of our skeleton crew. The stench made sleep impossible, so everyone retreated to starboard side and gathered around the captain. He reported that someone from the maritime service would arrive after daylight with a clean-up crew. On the ship were dead bodies from the ship's crew and the Japanese kamikaze plane, which had to be removed before anything else could be accomplished. Also, he warned us explosives were stored below, along with several tons of rotting beef. The foul meat had to be cleared from ice boxes in the refrigeration compartment that stopped working when the ship's power was snuffed out. The same USMS official who had put us aboard the Augustus Thomas arrived later that morning. He brought along soldiers from Gray's registration service, whose duty it was to remove the bodies and see to their proper burial. Another crew of Filipino workers carried out the rotted beef, and the attending army tug pumped in seawater to hose everything down. Gradually the stench abated somewhat. We helped the work, and I came across a hand-sized piece of the suicide plane's fuselage and part of a crystal bomb sight lying among the debris on the starboard side. Both would become lifetime souvenirs of the Pacific War. While he was on board, the chief administrator conferred with the captain and chief engineer about transferring our whole volunteer crew to the Sharon. It appeared the Sharon would require less work than Thomas to become seaworthy enough to sail her to a shipyard in America for major repairs. This plan would mean a loss of comfort for crew, as all officer quarters were destroyed when the Sharon was hit. We examined the part of the engine room where that was above the 9 feet of water present, inspecting the other vital equipment, and toured the crew quarters where we would be housed. And the new proposal, which included the same conditions as those we assumed with the Thomas, aroused both hopes and doubts for me. Overriding all concerns was the huge hole slashed into the engine room hull of the Thomas by the kamikaze plane. The underwater welders might never be able to close that breach. Which ship would get us home faster and alive? We faced a critical decision that involved many factors, and I immediately set out to determine the extent of the Sharon's mechanical damage. Once on board, I noted that the exhaust stack would have to be cut away completely and replaced from the boat deck up, a huge task. I made my way up to the fiddly deck for a bird's-eye view of the flooded engine. From the beam of my flashlight, I saw that the 3 idle steam-powered generators appeared to be perfectly normal, dry and undamaged. Knowing that a functional electrical system would soon be possible was an essential advantage. I descended the ladder to the electrical switchboard on the platform level of the generators. All of its equipment looked completely dry and sound. Most of the main engine stood above water and appeared to be undamaged. In fact, only the main and crank bearings were submerged. Although I would be involved in all equipment repairs, as the newly promoted second assistant engineer, my primary responsibility would be to operation of the boilers and blowers and fuel pumps. I knew that my most critical task would be to rebuild the brickwork in boiler boxes damaged by the burning Japanese plane. It promised to be a staggering task, and one I had never performed on a ship. There was no instruction in the King's Point curriculum for this repair. Despite our reservations, by the time the administrator returned on the following day, each of us had decided to sign on for transfer to the Sharon. As the only engineer other than the aging chief, I insisted that the portable generator we had been promised be delivered without delay, and the USMS officer agreed. We transferred our few personal belongings to Sharon and said goodbye to Thomas and nearly a month of wasted efforts. Like this one. Just thinking about all that engineering was making me itch. Hence the hairspray. Second to last chapter. Although Cow's yards ultimately grabbed most of the attention during World War II, and the three mid-sized yards, Albina, CIW, and Wisco, built small fighting ships like subchasers and minesweepers, many other Portland companies would create their own impressive production records. Gunnarson's Bravo Company was another established Portland engineering firm founded in 1919 and noted for its experience in steel fabrication of various types, including trailers, wire wheels, and truck bodies. Before it retooled for war work in a property directly across the Willamette River from Swan Island. In 1939, the company developed and constructed the world's first resin-pressed laminated plywood lifeboats, using modern manufacturing techniques to produce compound curve panels. The Maritime Commission was satisfied, after testing, that Gunnarson's prototypes and ordered 1,000 moulded wood lifeboats in July 1942. From a downtown grain garage in Linton, the concern has expanded into one of the Pacific Coast's finest all-covered waterfront boat-building plants in northwest Portland. Payroll has jumped within a comparatively few months from 30 or 40 workers to a factory crew of 500 men, said the Oregon in August 1942. In its search for ways around the growing metal shortages that was hampering boat building nationally, Gunderson continued building lifeboats and other wooden craft and turned out more than 3,600 craft, lifeboats, landing craft mechanized, LCM, and rafts. Their name was often mentioned in national news stories about the production of the famed wooden PT boats and the plywood Higgins landing craft as one of the other major builders of wooden boats in the war effort. In addition, Gunnarsson also built a large number of welded steel landing craft, LCM-3s, which they called tank lighters. They were 50 foot long, 14 feet beam, and powered by twin GM diesel engines. They are used by the Navy to land Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons, or construction machinery and other equipment on beaches all over the Pacific Theatre. These hulls, essentially barges, were simple but rugged enough to operate in exposed waters. The company created an exhibit featuring a tank lighter and two lifeboats for the Portland Invasion Exposition in the summer of 1943. This is very popular because they had the only exhibit that allowed the public to stand in the boats by walking up the ramp. The tank lighter was almost invisible beneath the hundreds of visitors, said the company publication, the Gunnarsson and Gunner. They also offered rides on the river as a way to raise their profile. Although the lighter was basically a bare hull, management still encouraged the workers to suggest ways to simplify construction. They dedicated an entire page of the Gunner to listing the latest crop of ideas, identified by number only, plus the standard appeal to buy more war bones. This may have convinced the Navy that they could be relied upon to step up deliveries of tank lighters by recruiting enough new workers to man a third shift. This number one priority means that promiscuous issuing of quit slips must stop, because unless we retain persons who are qualified to perform the work of building this craft, we cannot expect assistance from the government agencies in getting a small manpower, the gaffer warned in the next issue of the Gunnarsson Gunner. Henceforth, no quit slips will be issued until full circumstances of every case have been fully investigated. All the victory bonds and ballyhoo about winning the war will not do the job unless all of us stay on the job. I'm sure none of us here at Gunnarsson wants to let the boys down on the firing line. Apparently that did the trick, because before the war ended, the company went on to build many more lighters, for a total of 442, 5 YTL 66-foot tugs, and 10 YTN 170-foot barges. Gunnarsson has the distinction of being the only one of the 7 local shipbuilders to remain in business. They acquired a complete fabrication plant at Sitway on the northwest Front Avenue, where construction of commercial vessels such as tugs, barges, and trawlers began in 1947. By the 1970s, the company was building vessels as long as 650 foot and as wide as 100 feet on a side launch ramp, and became one of the premier barge builders on the west coast after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989, when all new barges and tankers were required to have full double hulls. It's a good book. It's a really, really cool book. A really cool book. And I just noticed I forgot to plug in the laptop. This one. And we're going to go to Norman Freeman. Of course we're going to Norman Freeman. Surely the most striking development in the US Navy from the late 1970s on was the change in the status of its surface command ships, from escorts to capital ships. From the middle of the Second World War through to the late 1970s, these ships were primarily escorts for the only effective offensive ships, the carriers. In that role, they changed enormously, guns being exchanged for missiles and grease pencils plots for computers. However, in a fundamental sense, they did not change at all. Even the advent of the Harpoon anti-ship missile made little difference. In an important sense, it was a long-range equivalent to guns and torpedoes of the past. The key point was that carrier aircraft greatly outranged anything a surface ship could fire. A second point, very nearly as important, was that apart from shore bombardment, no surface combatant could inflict much damage on targets on land. It seemed that surface ships were inevitably secondary to carriers. As the US carrier force shrank, that limited capability came to have more and more strategic significance. First, the US Navy could handle very few crises simultaneously. In the 1970s, with a total of 12 carriers, the Navy could keep only 4 forward deployed at any one time, usually 2 in the Mediterranean and 2 in the Far East. The situation was somewhat eased by permanently basing carriers abroad, most prominently in Yokosuka, but numbers could never be sufficient. The Navy did have much larger numbers of surface combatants, but in the early 1970s it seemed unlikely that, without a carrier, they could survive mass attacks by Soviet long-range bombers, carrying standoff missiles. They could not, then, operate independently. The development of Aegis anti-air warfare systems seemed to solve this particular problem, but it did not provide surface combatants with anything remotely like the offensive firepower of carriers. In the 1970s, with too many commitments and too few carriers to meet it done, the US Navy considered building what it called a strike cruiser, a nuclear-powered surface combatant armed with Aegis. Inferior strike cruiser could operate alone, providing naval presence in a medium threat area, and thus freeing carrier battle groups from more dangerous areas. In fact, to be effective, a ship on a presence mission ought to present a real threat to those ashore. The best strike cruiser could do was a single lightweight 8-inch gun. This problem was symbolized by a proposed strike cruiser variant provided with a short-angled flight deck from which Stovall aircraft could be flown. This provided the offensive punch the ship otherwise lacked. The ship would have to make do with relatively few aircraft because in a moderate threat situation, Aegis would have made up for absence of defending fighters and their radar aircraft. In fact, the combination was so expensive that the strike cruiser was never built, either as a nuclear surface combatant or as a small aircraft carrier. The situation a quarter of a century later is radically different. The US government often calls upon US service combatants to attack very different distant land targets during 1998 in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Sudan, and during early 1999 in Kosovo as well. All US cruisers and missile destroyers function in fact as strike cruisers, albeit without a nuclear power plant that would have made the strike cruiser of the 1970s truly autonomous. Something remarkable had happened. It was the combination of a new kind of missile, Tomahawk, with space assets for both surveillance and communication. The new missile could hit targets 1,000 miles away. The space assets extended a ship's horizon to the point where the range was worthwhile. The combination did not make a surface combatant into an aircraft carrier, but it did transform the fleet in a way that is only now becoming evidence. It's a very good book. It was written and published in 2001. It's worth reading. Even if the copy I did get was about £1, thanks to a tear in the cover. and a very good second-hand shop. Finally, Warship Builders by Thomas Heinrich. U.S. Naval Shipbuilding, 1922 to 1945. And yeah, let's go to the private yards chapter 5. Established shipyards with decades-long experience in naval shipbuilding constituted the vibrant core of private sector warship construction. Like the Navy yards, they differ considerably in size and specialization. While Newport News Shipbuilding, Fall River, and New York Ship constructed mostly battleships, carriers, and cruisers, medium-sized yards like Bath Iron Works, Electric Boat, and Federal Ship delivered destroyers and submarines. During the war, they were joined by merchant builders and engineering firms, in addition to defunct yards reactivated under government auspices. The Navy also funded the construction of wartime emergency yards, which turned out destroyer escorts and landing craft in government-owned, contractor-operated yards. All told, private and contractor-operated yards produced more than 80% of naval tonnage during the war. Navy funding of facility upgrades was critical to their performance. New York Ship, for example, is practically a government yard. The government pays for everything in there, a congressman pointed out. If they need extra help, extra supervisors to take care of this work and can get them, the government pays for them. Students of industrial mobilization often emphasize the role of large corporations in American wartime construction. Political economists like Joe Fagan and Kelly Redder, for example, have argued that fulfillment of state procurement and production needs was arranged for maximum big business input, with nearly 8% of $175 billion in prime defense contracts going to General Motors alone. A closer look reveals that prime contractors stood atop complex production pyramids, swarming with thousands of suppliers, specialty parts, and subsystems. Though more than two-thirds of prime wartime contracts indeed went to 100 corporations, only a handful were vertically integrated, like Ford's famous Willow Run aircraft factory, where even rivets were produced in-house. Vertical integration is, of course, a corporate strategy that concentrates raw materials, product procurement, manufacture of subsystems, assembly, and sales in one organization. Recent studies of aircraft manufacture have explored alternatives involving inter-firm linkages, cross-licensing, and subcontracting arrangements, which enabled core firms to assemble vast numbers of bombers and fighter planes from designs and parts supplied by specialty firms. B-29 bomber production at Boeing, Bell Aircraft, and Glenn Martin, for example, involved no fewer than 1,400 subcontractors. A case study of light cruiser construction, presented later in this chapter, documents similar production formats to naval work, where shipyards relied on supply networks to produce everything from boilers and turbines to draft blowers and specialty valves. The evidence presented here strengthens the case for a reinterpretation of American industrial mobilization to include some disintegrated production formats. It is a very good chapter, but I am approaching the half-hour mark, so I am going to sort of try and finish up here. The point I'm trying to make today is don't judge things by first covers. First appearances can be very, very deceiving. They can also be accurate, but you don't know until you do further study. Second to last chapter, it's my trick. It might not always be right. It so far tends to work out right for me when I'm in stores and I'm looking at books, especially when I'm picking up books which I might not know much about the topic, but I've decided it looks like a cool one to read. Hence, there might be a third book arriving on Catafax at some point. We'll leave that to one side. When you're talking about history, it's very easy to get wrapped up talking about the sexy stuff, the battles, the big names. The big political occasions, the big occurrences. If you're talking about the American Civil War, or the War of the Four Kingdoms, the UK Civil War, You cannot start off by going, well, this year it happens, the war happens. Because it's not. You can honestly trace the American Civil War back to the 13 colonies. Well before the American Revolution, well before American independence, all these things, you can trace it back. You can trace it back to the issues and the structural issues which they're built into that economy. And into the economy as America grows and becomes the nation which has the Civil War. With the war in the UK, the Civil War, sometimes called the English Civil War, but that's silly because in the nicest way, the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scots all get involved. It's the War of the Four Kingdoms. A big chunk of it comes from the Scottish aristocratic perception, especially the monarchy, that England was rich and they were going to be living a life of clover once they were monarchs of it. No understanding that England was a different political system, was a very different scenario, and it wasn't that same situation. It was manageable by James I. Why? Because he was a canny politician. Charles I was not a canny politician. In any sense of imagination. And there are a lot of issues within it. And then it comes to Charles II, who is a very canny politician. Now, he takes over after Oliver Cromwell, who was another fairly canny politician. Yes, he was a good general, but he was also a very good politician. Let's be honest, how does he get the Huguenots to still think he's their greatest friend whilst not actually having to support them? He says, if you give me the right deal, I will come myself at a head of army. I won't send you troops. Just send you troops. Huguenots do not want Cromwell in France. Yeah, they want the troops, but they don't want Cromwell. You have Cromwell in France, you might well have a very different scenario, because Cromwell is a very, very good general, but he's also very good at building alliances with local powers. That's half the reason why the Parliament wins the War of the Four Kingdoms. It's because of the local alliances. There were whole local areas which opted out of the war, which had their own standing armies under their own lords and nobles. Yeah, you don't want to mess in those. You don't want to. Parliament's good at making friends with them. The king expects them to support them. When it comes to these books, if you forget infrastructure, if you forget logistics, if you forget the sacrifices that go into getting the supplies there in the first place, and just focus on on the arrival of the supplies or the impact of the supplies once they're there, you miss a lot of the story. You miss a lot of the history. And you miss a lot of the lessons you need to learn. There is a strong argument to be made that without the orders that America gets in 1938, 1939, 1940, and 1941, it would not have been able to do the bit of war building that it managed to do. But then you go and look at it and goes, well, those orders were in many ways funded by, and I've done my own videos on this, on Lend-Lease and various other things before that. And you should go, well, isn't that the American government? Well, the American government can't justify making those orders. But they have to be reliable enough in delivery that they can make those orders. If their word doesn't mean anything, if they aren't investing and can't deliver those orders, then no one's going to bother to take a loan off them to invest it. We talk about Canada in World War II. We forget that one of the big things Canada does is they've been, whilst they didn't build ships, they didn't build vast armies in the 1930s, they did build a huge amount of infrastructure and a huge industry that would be critically, that was able to be expanded and was critically supportive during World War II. So the thing about all these books, all four of these books, is you have to look below the surface. You have to look below the covers, and you have to look below the cover, beyond the cover in history. You learn so much more, and it gets so much richer, so much more intricate. The complexity of history is astounding because it is the complexity of the human minds writ large, and geography. So, for those of you that, and depending on whether your view is that is the product purely of tectonics or a guiding master plan by an almighty being, history is the tapestry it weaves. All that combination. It's worth looking at it deeper than the bite size and the front covers. Take care. Hope you enjoyed, and see you on Thursday for Would the Allies have won the Cold War? Or would they have got smacked? Take care.